Hello, very good morning to you. Just weeks after taking office, this morning, the new Chancellor will unveil a major plan to boost economic growth. Kwasi Kwarteng is expected to announce tens of billions of pounds of tax cuts and increased spending, which he says will break the vicious cycle of stagnation in his mini-budget. The plans are expected to require a sharp rise in public borrowing. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
They hope it's a plan to make the British economy bloom. Growth, the new focus of a new government, with massive tax cuts the order of the day. Welcome News says this small business.
Things have gone up so much in our trade, the same as with the food, with fuel, everything. Personally, from me, tax cuts would be massive. That would be one of the main things. Obviously, to give us some tax breaks, maybe to help us a bit more to get over COVID, with everybody was closed and things were quiet.
New Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng has been the local MP here in Staines, part of Spelthorne in Surrey, for more than a decade. Now the whole country about to hear what he'll do differently to rev up the economy. Slashing rules he thinks hold back growth, junking the rise in national insurance and corporation tax, a boost for tourism and almost 40 low-tax investment zones. These are more modest outlay, handpicked by the Chancellor and being packed off to Conservative conference. But the brewery owner who made them needs more support.
This industry really is struggling and hasn't recovered from COVID. We really need measures that will help us get back on our feet, especially as we've seen 400% plus rises in the energy estimates and costs already. So we were already struggling before, but with these increases, it becomes unsustainable.
Whether it's reversing tax rises, cutting stamp duty, or making it easier and cheaper to build in certain parts of the country, Kwasi Kwarteng's first major statement to Parliament as Chancellor, with more than 30 measures costing more than £2 billion every minute, is based on a big bet. He's hoping that as he spends and spends and spends, that growth will come and voters will be grateful.
A mini-budget, but a big gamble. There'll only be one chance to spend on this scale this side of an election. Will the bill be too big for comfort? Sam Coates, Sky News.
Well, I'm joined now by the Levelling Up Secretary, Simon Clarke. A very good morning to you, Simon Clarke. So we're told that the central mission of this so-called fiscal event is to ignite growth by lowering taxes and cutting regulation. But where is the evidence that cutting taxes will stimulate growth? The Institute for Fiscal Studies say it's a gamble at best. So is this plan just a big gamble?
No, it's not. It's about asserting that if we want to get back to the trend growth that this country enjoyed before the 2008 financial crisis, the 2.5% average that we used to see, then we need to get back to the measures that we know work, and which, of course, we saw during the 1980s and 1990s helped to stimulate a period of huge prosperity in the British economy. And that is to say, making sure that alongside, clearly, a major programme of government investment, that we focus on the real drivers of growth, and that is to say, reducing the burden of tax facing both businesses and families. That's something which the Prime Minister put at the heart of her leadership campaign this summer. And today we're going to see that translated into action through what I think will be a really important and game-changing financial statement.
OK, well, let's take a look at one element of it. We're expecting a scrapping of the planned rise in corporation tax. You talked about how business will be affected, but what difference will that make, for example, to growth? Will it actually work? The Institute for Public Policy Research has questioned this theory that low corporate taxes boost growth. They point out that in 2019, the UK had the lowest corporation tax in the G7, and yet we also had the lowest rate of business investment.
Well, corporation tax is just one of the levers that we need to look at as part of the drive to unlock growth. And clearly it's not for me to preempt what the Chancellor is going to say in his statement later this morning. You cited national insurance a few moments ago. It's obviously vital that we honour the pledge that was made during the 2019 general election campaign, that we wouldn't raise that tax. And that's something which the Chancellor has confirmed will now be scrapped with effect from the 6th of November, that increase in tax. That's worth £330 for 28 million people. But he's obviously going to go much further than that, and he's going to tackle what is a record high tax burden on families and businesses, reflecting clearly the fact we've gone through some extraordinarily difficult years, but setting out a fundamentally new approach to go for growth, to make sure that we win the argument that a more successful enterprise economy is good for the whole of this country, and it's that which we need to unlock today.
Well, if you're confident that this plan will work and growth will be boosted, why has the Office for Budget Responsibility not been asked to produce its independent analysis of what it means for the economy, as would normally go alongside statements like this?
Well, the OBR will be producing a full forecast later in the financial year.
But why not now?
Well, precisely because, as they themselves have said, that given this is a short notice event, they would not be able to complete the usual quality of analysis that they would offer. And so they will be asked to conduct that modelling alongside subsequent events later in this financial year. This is an attempt to kickstart growth. It's delivered at short notice, at great speed, and we've been working on it huge rapidity over recent days. But it is not something which the OBR can model to their usual standards, but they will be doing so in due course.
But are you concerned of the effect that could have on the markets? The pound, for example, has taken a hit recently. Don't the markets need to see what these policies will do for the economy and whether we can afford them?
What the markets want to know is whether the UK economy is going to grow, and that is something which the Chancellor is setting at the absolute heart of our strategy, that the UK wants to get back to those levels of trend growth that we used to enjoy, and critically catch up with other parts of the world where dynamic economies are surging ahead. The risk is that Europe is in a pattern of stagnation. Britain can't afford to be part of that, and we need to set out today how we are going to get to a much higher level of sustainable growth, and that's going to be driven through lowering the burden of tax.
Well, if the rise in corporation tax is scrapped, then businesses will be very happy. Liz Truss has acknowledged that the scrapping of the rise in national insurance will benefit the wealthier more. Labour says that this government has moved from levelling up to trickle down. You're levelling up secretary. Are you worried about this government being seen to be helping the better off more than the poorer people?
Absolutely not. This whole term trickle down is such a nonsense, and is itself a centre-left mischaracterisation of what this government is all about. We need to grow the economy because a more successful economy is good for everybody. If we have a more successful economy, then the tax take goes up. That tax is what funds our vital public services. It is a virtuous circle, as the Chancellor will be saying later today. We need to get to a situation where the UK economy is stronger, is more dynamic, is more robust. That in turn makes it easier to pay for the services on which the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society rely. And as Levelling Up Secretary, I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be going for growth, going for new policies like investment zones, which will benefit some of the most left behind communities in our country and help to unlock growth opportunities there. So I'm really excited about today, and I'm absolutely confident that a more successful economy driven by lower taxation is the way to greater prosperity for everybody, regardless of where you come from or what your circumstances are.
It's so interesting because when you were Chief Secretary to the Treasury not so long ago, when the national insurance rise was announced, you were a big fan of it. So why are you so pleased that that's now being reversed?
Well, I served the government of the day, and with a new Prime Minister comes new prerogatives. But to be clear, we're going to stand behind the investment in our NHS and social care that was announced by Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. We're just going to pay for it through general taxation rather than through this specific levy. So there's going to be no change to our level of commitment to fund the health service. What we are saying is that we want to have a more dynamic enterprise economy alongside it, which will obviously make it easier to pay for that healthcare over the long term.
Well, let's look a little bit more about how it's being paid for, because back when the national insurance rise was being introduced, you said then that the government had to be honest with people about the need to raise the money. You said it was simply irresponsible for us to whack it all on our debt when we know that's already at a record high. And you said that just amounts to taxes being deferred for the next generation. So are you now being irresponsible, whacking this all on our debt?
No, because what you're doing now is you're going for growth alongside it. I think the critical thing is we need to get the economy growing so that, frankly, the economic growth trajectory outstrips that of our debt, and that is what the government is determined to help deliver. The fundamental difference between our philosophy and Labour is that they would be spending on non-productive outputs. We will be making a statement today which is about actually unlocking the productive sectors of the economy. If you are creating the conditions for stronger underlying growth through tax cuts, that's a very different proposition to just spending for spending's sake, which is what the opposition, I'm afraid, remain committed to doing. We are trying to unlock better trend growth, and that puts obviously the whole question of how you pay for public services on a fundamentally different footing. You're talking about a very different economic proposition and a very, frankly, bold and welcome switch to an open embrace of growth as the main task of the Exchequer.
We're told that part of the plans are these local investment zones in 38 areas in England, which involve, amongst other things, liberalising local planning to release more land for housing and commercial development. So how much say will local residents have in the planning and the building of this infrastructure in their area?
Well, investment zones are a really important part of the Chancellor's statement, and I shouldn't preempt that. But what I can say is that these zones will only happen where there is local consent, and we've been very clear about that in the discussions we've been having with local authorities and mayors over recent days as we've been testing the proposition with them. I'm delighted to say there's been a huge level of enthusiasm in those discussions, and we hope to be able to make very rapid progress over the next few weeks in terms of confirming where these zones will be located. But to be clear, they will only happen where there is a local appetite for them to occur. There will be no top-down imposition of these zones. We want to obviously create the best possible opportunity for local areas to get both targeted tax breaks and a liberalised planning regime, and that's something which we'll be setting out more detail on over the coming hours.
Well, on the subject of local appetite for things, Jacob Rees-Mogg announced yesterday that the government's lifting the ban on fracking. Would you welcome fracking in your constituency?
Well, the key point with fracking, as with investment zones, is that it will happen where there is local consent, and where there is local consent only. It is right, clearly, that we look to explore all possible sources of energy generation, including renewables, the nuclear industry, and conventional oil and gas, to make sure that we never again find ourselves in a position where we are so vulnerable to the actions of a hostile state, in this case, Russia.
So you want it in your constituency?
Well, no, to be clear, Anna, this is a matter for local communities and for local authorities and the planning process to determine wherever this can take place. That is the consent log on whether fracking goes ahead in any community. So it's not a matter for me or for any MP. It's a question of what local communities want.
And today's fiscal event, you described it as radical, I think. If it is such a radical change to how things were done before, should there not be a general election and this be put to the people? No,
the country at this point needs clarity and certainty of government. We had a general election less than 3 years ago. There's a government with a strong majority in the House of Commons, and there's an urgent need for action today. That's why we've brought forward this package at the speed that we have, precisely because as the world goes through this extremely challenging winter, driven obviously by the ongoing after effects of COVID, but most seriously by Russia's criminal actions in Ukraine and attempts to weaponize energy, this country needs growth now. That's what we're going to deliver, and it's going to make life better for everybody. OK, well, Simon Clarke, Secretary of State for Levelling Up, thanks very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Let's take you straight to Downing Street and talk to our political correspondent, Rob Powell. So, Rob, this big event takes place just in a matter of a few hours now. So what have we learned about what it will involve?
Well, I think we're starting to get an idea, Anna, of the scale of what they are planning today and the break from the past. Because I think whilst the presentation and the choreography of all this will look a bit like a mini version of a budget, I think the content of what we'll hear today and also the tone will be anything but miniature. And I think we started to get that a little bit from Simon Clarke just then. He set out right at the top of that interview that they wanted to get growth, economic growth, back to where it was pre-financial crisis, pre-2008, and said that they needed to go back to measures that they knew worked. So suggesting essentially that the approach to the economy for the last 14 years hasn't been working. Now, a reminder that 12 of those 14 years has been under Conservative-led government, and that gives you an indication, I think, of the extent to which they will be setting out a break from previous Conservative policies towards the economy today. And then in terms of policy and in terms of content, we already know a lot of what is going to come around that reversal of the national insurance rise, changes to corporation tax, probably a cut to stamp duty as well. There are still big questions, though, about how all this is paid for in the long term. We know in the short term that this will come from more borrowing. There is uncertainty about what that will mean for how the UK is viewed internationally and whether it is essentially viewed as much of a safe bet in terms of handling the economy as it always has been. And Simon Clarke said in that interview that the long-term plan is basically to pay for it from the tax take that comes from an economy growing. Well, that all relies, of course, on these measures working and the economy growing. Simon Clarke says this isn't a gamble, but it is, and a big one.
Thanks very much indeed, Rob. Well, let's take you to Romford in East London now. Our correspondent, Shingi Mararike. Morning to you, Shingi. How do people feel there about this mini-budget that's coming later this morning? What do they want to hear from it?
Morning, Anna. So Romford, where we are, is in Havering, which is one of the most deprived boroughs in the capital. And it's the sort of place where the cost of living crisis is starting to bite more than others. And today we've had YouGov figures come out which are suggesting that people are already cutting back on their household spending because of the cost of living going up. Those figures show that among people on the lowest incomes, earning less than £20,000 a year, that 28% have been forced to reduce spending on household essentials, while 29% have had to make cuts to buying their staple foods. Here, it's also a market which is starting to pick up. As you can see, there are people behind me starting to open their stalls. And obviously, that will be a key part of that budget, how small businesses are supported. I've had a walk around and spoken to people who are saying that it is already really difficult to maintain a business. One man whose stall sells noodles was saying that there, the cost of the oil, the cost of the food, and the cost of getting the food there has gone up, while people who are selling clothes, even if the clothes themselves are not more expensive, again, the cost of putting fuel in your van to go and pick up supply has gone up. So here we're really seeing a crossover between the personal elements of this cost of living crisis and also the impact it is having on small businesses as well. I've also heard people saying that things like ending the national insurance hike will help. Every little helps, and they are supportive of the government statement. So what we have here is a reminder that this will be a deeply divisive budget, with some people in support, whereas other people saying that no matter what happens, it won't be enough. We're already struggling.
Yeah, it'd be so interesting to get people's reaction once we know all the details, won't it? Shingi, thanks very much indeed. And talking of details, we will have full coverage of the government's mini-budget in a special programme on Sky News. That's from 9 o'clock this morning. Right now, though, let's take a quick look at the front pages of this morning's papers. And let's start with the Eye. It's reporting that millions of people are facing an increase in their mortgage payments as the UK heads into a recession. The Guardian focuses on that warning of a recession by the Bank of England as the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng unveils his mini-budget. In contrast, the Daily Telegraph leads with Mr Kwarteng's warning to the bank that it must get a grip on inflation. And biggest tax cuts for 30 years is how the Daily Mail describes the prospects for today's mini-budget. Do stay with us, lots to come in just a moment. I'm going to be joined by the economist and former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, Andrew Sentance, ahead of that mini-budget. Also, I'll speak to the UK's former permanent representative to the UN, Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, as leaders gathered at the United Nations condemned Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat. And then coming up just after 8 o'clock this morning, Labour's perspective on the mini-budget. I'll be speaking to the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden. Now, 4 areas of eastern Ukraine controlled by Russia and pro-Moscow forces will begin holding referenda today on becoming part of Russia. Well, voting in the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as the southern regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia, is expected to run until Tuesday. Ukraine's government and its Western allies say the whole exercise is a sham. Well, in a moment, we'll get the view from Moscow with our correspondent there, Alex Rossi. But first to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in Kharkiv for us this morning. And Deborah, fill us in on what's happening on the ground and the context for these referenda that are taking place from today.
Yes, this move by President Putin is an escalation in his war effort, and it comes as a result of a lightning advance by Ukrainian forces, a counter-offensive that was launched at the end of August against Russian positions in Kherson, and then on the 6th of September in this area in the northeast of Ukraine, in the Kharkiv region, with Ukrainian forces retaking swathes of territory, pushing the Russian troops right back out of largely all of Kharkiv region. There is skirmishes, there's definite combat still happening around certain areas, including the city of Kupiansk, which is at the outer edges of the region. But that shock advance by Ukraine really showing the Russian forces wanting in terms of their ability to hold their defensive lines seems to have spurred President Putin to accelerate what had widely been anticipated in terms of these referendums, the plan being to annex these territories, to see them as Russian, and then that gives the Russian president greater powers in terms of his response. We've obviously already had this mobilization order, but the concern that Western allies are looking at is the nuclear option too. Might an annexed part of Ukraine that Ukraine rightfully tries to retake, as it continues to do, then trigger Russia taking an even graver step in this war and escalating it up to a nuclear conflict. It's a concern that has been alive ever since the beginning of the large-scale invasion back on the 24th of February. But it does seem to be growing in terms of the concern about it. No one's panicking yet, but clearly it's an option that President Putin doesn't try to hide when he talks about what might happen next.
Deborah, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's bring in Alex Rossi now, who's in Moscow. And Alex, the announcement about referendum has come alongside a call-up of reservists as well. How has this week's these announcements gone down amongst people there in Russia?
Well, if you take into account, Anna, the fact that only a few weeks ago, leaders in those occupied regions that are now staging these sham referenda were saying that it's too early to call referendums because all of those regions are not fully under Russian control, but they have accelerated it. There is a sense here, I think, that Vladimir Putin is somewhat rattled by the counter-offensive that has taken place, pushing Russian forces out of the Kharkiv region, and they need to now hold these votes, these sham votes, as Deborah was saying, so that they can have greater military power in terms of the assets that they can deploy and that they have to use. It's, of course, similar to what we saw in 2014 in the Crimea. There, a vote on annexation was held. I think something like 95% of the population voted in favour of it, in inverted commas, and we can expect a similar result now. It is something of a foregone conclusion. But certainly on the ground, in terms of ordinary people here, what's rattling people a great deal is this partial mobilisation. Now, according to the Defence Ministry, that could see something like 300,000 people drafted in, 300,000 men drafted in to join the front lines into the meat grinder in Ukraine. But I think people are extremely worried. If you talk to NGOs, human rights organisations, they say that they have been contacted by large numbers of people who are extremely concerned that their rights are going to be violated and they will be drafted in. Now, the Defence Ministry says that it is only people who've had previous active military experience. But Anecdotally, we're seeing that that isn't the case either. And some people say that as many as 1 million people could be affected by this. Now, again, anecdotally, we are seeing larger numbers of people trying to get out of the country. There have been reports of large queues at the borders of neighbouring countries like Finland, young men of conscript age trying to get out. Also, we are seeing that the price of airline tickets out of Russia to countries that you don't need a visa to, they are also increasing in price dramatically as well. So it's hard to say at this point what effect this will have on Russian society, but certainly all the signs are it could be fairly corrosive. It is something that Vladimir Putin has so far resisted doing, calling people up into what is effectively a war, but he is still calling a special military operation.
Alex Rossi there in Moscow, thanks very much indeed. And thanks to Deborah Haynes in Kharkiv. Well, also making the news this morning.
Welcome home, Aidan.
5 British men captured by Russian-backed forces in Ukraine are back in the UK after an international diplomatic effort led to a major prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. Aidan Aslin, seen here, John Harding, Dylan Healy, Andrew Hill and Sean Pinner have all been reunited with their families after their sudden release. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of 15-year-old Kari McLean. The teenager died in hospital on Wednesday after being stabbed close to the entrance of North Huddersfield Trust School in West Yorkshire. Syrian authorities say more than 30 people have drowned after a boat capsized off the northern port city of Tartus. The boat, said to have been carrying up to 150 refugees and migrants, is thought to have been going from Lebanon to Europe. More than a dozen people have been rescued. Iran's president has declared that acts of chaos are not acceptable in a warning to protesters in the country. Large numbers of people have taken to the streets in fury over the death of a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, who'd been arrested by Iran's morality police. At least 9 people have been killed in clashes since last week. As the government pushes for an electric future on our roads, drivers say there's a lack of places to plug in. In a survey of electric vehicle owners, the consumer group Which found 3/4 of people are unhappy with the public charging system. About half reported difficulty finding one that works. Now, a modified herpes virus has shown promise, killing off cancer cells, with one patient seeing the disease vanish entirely. Patients were injected with a drug that was a weakened form of the cold sore virus that had been modified to kill tumours. While more research is needed, it could offer a lifeline for those living with advanced stage cancer. That sounds rather amazing. Let's take a look now at what the weather's up to.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, today's going to bring sunshine and showers, but the south will see more general rain for a time. And it's a mostly clear and chilly start with some patchy fog, but southern Britain is cloudy and mild with outbreaks of rain. That rain will clear southeast Wales through the morning, but will continue to affect central and southern England. Heavy, perhaps thundery downpours are possible, mainly near Channel coastal areas in the southeast. Elsewhere, a scattering of showers will develop from the west.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
A Cornish castle linked with the legends of King Arthur is at risk of being lost to the sea. English Heritage is warning that Tintagel could tumble into the ocean as climate change increases the pace of coastal erosion. It's one of 6 beloved spots that the heritage body says could be lost if nothing is done to protect them. So let's get more now on the mini-budget that we're expecting in a few hours' time. Well, a short while ago, the Levelling Up Secretary Simon Clarke told me that the mini-budget will outline a new approach based on growth, and he denied that the plan to cut tax was a gamble.
We need to get back to the measures that we know work, and which, of course, we saw during the 1980s and 1990s helped to stimulate a period of huge prosperity in the British economy. And that is to say, making sure that alongside, clearly, a major programme of government investment, that we focus on the real drivers of growth, and that is to say, reducing the burden of tax facing both businesses and families. That's something which the Prime Minister put at the heart of her leadership campaign this summer, and today we're going to see that translated into action through what I think will be a really important and game-changing financial statement.
You said it was simply irresponsible for us to whack it all on our debt when we know that's already at a record high. And you said that just amounts to taxes being deferred for the next generation. So are you now being irresponsible, whacking this all on our debt?
No, because what you're doing now is you're going for growth alongside it. I think the critical thing is we need to get the economy growing so that, frankly, the economic growth trajectory outstrips that of our debt.
Well, that was the Levelling Up Secretary talking to me a little bit earlier on. In the last few minutes, while we were playing that to you, we've seen the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Chris Philp, just arriving at Downing Street ahead of that mini-budget. So it's just a few hours away now, a couple of hours away now, and members of the government arriving for the discussions before that announcement by Kwasi Kwarteng a little bit later on. Well, also in Downing Street, whose beady eyes, no doubt, caught Chris Philp heading into number 10 there, is our political correspondent, Rob Powell, who joins me now. So we heard there from the Levelling Up Secretary that this mini-budget is going to be game-changing. Just how radical is it likely to be, do we think?
I think from the tone Simon Clarke adopted, we can see that it will be a significant break from the previous approach, from the previous Conservative administrations we've had for the last 12 years. When Chris Philp, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, just walked into number 10 just then, that's a job that Simon Clarke had before his current role. It's a job that Liz Truss had before as well. He was asked by the waiting journalists here whether the country can afford a tax cut, and he said absolutely. That is what we will hear today. We've already had a lot of those announcements trailed in advance around national insurance and corporation tax. I think that the sort of point of tension, if you like, and the big unknown is the costings behind it and the scrutiny that will be applied to it. We know that the OBR, the independent watchdog that essentially pulls apart the government's figures and plots forecasts for the coming years to tell the government how much money they've got to spend, they won't be an OBR forecast that accompanies this mini-budget today. I think given that we are likely to see the biggest tax-cutting statement in 30 years, many will see that as unusual, if not a little bit concerning. In terms of how this is all being paid for, in the short term it will be borrowing, in the long term it will be growth. But it is a gamble because there is no promise or certainty that these measures do spur growth, so no certainty whether the government in the long run will have the money there from taxes to pay for it all.
Rob, thanks very much indeed. Well, Rob's raised a number of questions, some of which I will put to our next guest, because today's mini-budget is being announced after another interest rate rise by the Bank of England, which said there'd be more to come as it fights inflation. With me now is Andrew Sentance, a senior advisor to Cambridge Econometrics and a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Very good to have you here with us this morning and so much to talk about. I'll come to the mini-budget in just a moment, but first, I'm very interested in your view on yesterday's rise in interest rates. Was that the right move by the Monetary Policy Committee to raise rates by 0.5%?
Well, it was certainly right to raise interest rates. Perhaps they could have gone further because it's quite clear that the interest rate we now have, 2.25%, is not going to be sufficient to get on top of inflation, which is nearly 10%, 5 times the Bank of England's target. So we're probably going to need further interest rate rises over the course of this year and into the first part of next year.
Should they have done more this time? There had been an expectation they'd go for a 0.75% rise.
Well, if I'd been on the MPC, I would have been voting with the 3 members who wanted a 0.75% rise. And I think that was fully justified. And we've seen in the United States them raising interest rates by 0.75% on 3 occasions. And in Sweden, for example, recently they raised interest rates by 1%. So other central banks are being a bit more robust and a bit more significant in terms of their interest rate policies.
Well, yes, and what do you think the impact of the mini-budget will be? As we were talking to the Levelling Up Secretary, he was talking about a raft of tax cuts, or certainly cancelling tax rises as part of this fiscal event. What impact will tax cuts have on inflation?
Well, I think the danger that we face at the moment, if you've got the Bank of England pushing up interest rates, trying to keep a lid on inflation and try and contain demand in the economy, and then the government with the other lever of economic policy, fiscal policy, putting a big energy price support package, which is going to be funded by borrowing. And then we'll see later today quite a few tax cuts are in the offing. And that's going to add to demand in the economy. So it's a bit of a push me, pull you type of situation with economic policy, with monetary policy, trying to dampen down inflation. But fiscal policy, tax and government spending policy, putting more money back into the economy.
So the two are working in opposite directions, the government and the Bank of England?
Well, that's the danger. And it depends on how people respond to the various measures that Kwasi Kwarteng is going to announce today. I think the biggest measure is going to be the energy support package, which people are talking about being 100 to 150 billion. But there's also discussion or newspaper talk about up to £50 billion of tax cuts on the top of that. So that's a very big fiscal stimulus.
Well, yes, and it's a lot of money being spent, but one of the points of the energy support package is not just to help people be able to afford their bills, of course, but won't it have an effect of dampening down inflation by limiting prices?
Yes, that's the sort of the positive side of the borrowing we're going to see a large announcement of extra borrowing. But the positive side is that some of that is going towards helping to ease the cost of living pressures. And that should help head off some of the wage pressures which could fuel future inflation. And that's one of the dangers that we face at the moment in the UK economy.
The Bank of England said yesterday that it's possible we're already in recession. Do you think they're right?
Well, I think it's not a recession as we've known it before. I mean, what they're talking about is 0.1% falls in GDP in consecutive quarters. Now, some people would technically call that a recession, but it's really a flat economy because 0.1% is very close to zero. Previous recessions, we've seen GDP falling by, say, 1% in a quarter or even more. So I think if you want to call it a recession, it's a very mild one at the moment, and it's probably better characterised as being a flat economy.
Well, the government says that it wants to make sure that we're not in recession. They want to boost growth with their tax-cutting plans. Will it work?
Well, I think there are two impacts from the tax cuts. One is that if they cut taxes financed by borrowing, that puts money into people's pockets and they will spend it. So that's a short-term demand boost. But that brings with it the risk of inflation. We have quite a tight labour market at the moment. Unemployment's very low, vacancies are very high. So the risk is that in the short term, instead of fueling growth, we end up with more inflation. Now, the other argument for these policies is over the longer term, they will boost economic growth by stimulating enterprise and investment. But that is a much longer term process. That may operate over 5 to 10 years, but it certainly doesn't operate over 1 to 2 years.
Well, yes, and just while you're talking, we're just looking at live pictures of people arriving for Cabinet. I think I saw Kit Malthouse going there into number 10 just in the last few minutes, obviously ahead of this big fiscal event, as the government is describing it. So how worried are you about the levels of borrowing required for the government's plans?
Well, I think we have to see what the Chancellor says. We know that there's going to be a large amount of borrowing for the energy price guarantee. But as you said, that can cut both ways for the economy. It's helping ease the cost of living pressures. But if we get an awful lot of tax reductions in this fiscal event, when government borrowing is already quite strained, I think that is a worry for the state of the economy and for inflation.
OK, well, that's a sobering note to end on. Andrew Sentance, thanks very much indeed for coming in. We appreciate it. Let's just go back to Downing Street, shall we? We were showing you people arriving in the last few minutes for Cabinet. There's Penny Mordaunt arriving ahead of Cabinet. We've already seen the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Chris Philp, arriving in the last few minutes, as well as Kit Malthouse as well. And Nadhim Zahawi has also gone inside too. So people arriving just now for Cabinet ahead of the mini-budget, which is earlier than you would normally expect these things to be. It's happening at 9:30 this morning. Now then, 20-time Grand Slam champion Roger Federer says he's ready for retirement as he prepares for his final professional match. He'll be seeing off by three of his biggest rivals and friends, Novak Djokovic, Andy Murray and Rafael Nadal, as they team up with him for one last time later on today at the Laver Cup in London. Well, Sky's Jackie Beltrao went to see them on the practice court.
The end of the Federer era is a huge blow to tennis and his millions of fans worldwide. But in true Federer-esque style, he's found the perfect way to bow out, reuniting the big four against the rest of the world, on the same side of the net as his greatest rival and friend, Rafa Nadal, and in London, the city of many of his iconic moments.
I just felt it would be wonderful having Borg on the chair, having the greatest players on the planet right now alongside me, and I just felt it wouldn't feel lonely, you know, because often when you retire, you're alone on the court, you've just probably lost your last match, and you're all emotional, talking how much it meant to you being in the game, and I thought I didn't want that. I didn't want that sad moment. I wanted to be happy and more like a party mode.
I was able to have to create an amazing rivalry together. And in the other hand, something that probably we are very proud. I have been a friendly rivalry, you know.
His 20 Grand Slams, including the 8 Wimbledon titles, have all been achieved with the style of a ballet dancer. His movement and effortless power inspiring many players, but replicated by none of them. Relatively untroubled by injury for a quarter of a century, the injured knee that's kept him out of tennis since Wimbledon 2021 has finally said enough is enough.
I think it should be good enough for a doubles, to be honest, but for the singles, honestly, I haven't trained at all the last 3 months, and it would just be too much to ask for the body, and I am not willing to put all the risk on the line for that.
Roger Federer and his agent Tony Godsick came up with the Laver Cup to honour his idol Rod Laver and in a way to mimic the Ryder Cup. He long ago eclipsed his hero in terms of titles, and when he finally says goodbye to tennis, it is going to be a special moment in sporting history. Federer has given so much to the sport. It's the end of an era, and there will be tears on and off the court. Jackie Beltrao, Sky News.
Voting has begun in Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine in referenda that Moscow is expected to use to justify the annexation of 4 regions. Ukraine's government and its Western allies describe the voting as a sham. Well, here with me to discuss that and the other issues around Ukraine is former UK representative to the UN, Sir Mark Lyall-Grant. Sir Mark, I want to ask you about your view on what these referenda are all about in a moment. But first, let's just focus on what happened at this special meeting at the UN Security Council. Russia's conduct in Ukraine was condemned widely there, but how important do you think that international criticism is, and how widespread has it been? Has anyone shifted their positions?
I don't think we've seen a big shift in positions, Anna, to be honest. It was a big set-piece event, 4 hours of the UN Security Council, and the vast majority of countries that spoke condemned the Russian invasion and their attempts at holding these sham referenda over the next 4 days. But we also saw the fact that some of the bigger neutral countries, if you like China, like India, Brazil, were still not naming Russia explicitly and calling simply for a ceasefire and dialogue and no fighting, etc. And we then also had Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, giving a completely Alice in Wonderland account of what was going on, claiming that Mother Russia was under attack from neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine, and that Russia had the right to defend itself and its speakers. So it was an important event, but it won't have changed, I think, many minds.
Well, yes, and ultimately, how much practical difference can condemnation at the UN make when Russia's got a veto on the Security Council?
Well, it can't. That's the reality of it, that the UN is only as strong as its members are willing to let it be. And if you are a permanent member of the Security Council, as Russia is, you can always veto more coercive action against you. So in that sense, the UN cannot stop this conflict. They can do quite a bit. You know, they've been participating in some of the prisoner exchanges. They negotiated the grain deal, for instance, and they've alleviated a lot of the humanitarian concerns, the crisis in Ukraine. They can also gather evidence for future justice through international tribunals, but they cannot directly prevent the war happening or send in peacekeepers or anything if Russia is prepared, as it clearly is, to use its veto in the UN Security Council.
But does President Putin, do you think, care about the kind of criticism that he's been under at the UN?
I think he will care because, you know, even the Chinese, although they didn't name Russia explicitly, said that they believe very strongly in sovereignty, non-interference, territorial integrity. Well, that's a very clear message to Putin, I think. And the fact that Lavrov, the foreign minister, turned up, made his speech and then immediately left, wasn't prepared to sit around and hear all the criticism of Russia's behavior, you know, is a sign that Putin can be sensitive to criticism, particularly from those who he might expect to be more sympathetic to him, like China, Brazil and India.
It's not just the referendums that have been announced by President Putin. He's also issued nuclear threats, and he's also announced the call-up of reservists. What's your interpretation of what he's up to?
I think we're entering a very dangerous period now, Anna. It's a combination of those three things exactly. You've got the mobilization of at least 300,000 reservists. You've got these sham referenda in 4 occupied territories now in eastern Ukraine. And you've got the increasingly violent rhetoric made more explicit by Dmitry Medvedev, the number 2, if you like, in Russia yesterday, saying that Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons to defend its territory. And I think it's now become clear what Putin's game plan is. He will annex these territories on the back of these sham referenda over the next few days, claim that they are now Russian territory, and that therefore any attack on these territories are an attack on Russia itself.